The rain had been falling since noon, and by dark it had turned into something heavier, the kind that soaks through wood and bone alike. Walter Briggs sat near the window of his small homestead and listened to it drum against the tin roof. He had a cup of something warm in his hands and nothing pressing to do, which was the way he liked most evenings. Bruno was already outside. That was the odd part. Bruno, a 13-year-old Labrador mix with graying jaws and hips that gave him trouble on cold mornings, had pushed the screen door open himself and walked out into the downpour without a sound. He had not barked. He had not looked back. He had simply gone to the edge of the property where the tree line started and sat down there in the mud and the dark. Walter pulled on his boots. He knew Bruno. He had known Bruno since the dog was a pup left in a cardboard box outside a gas station 30 miles down the mountain road. In 13 years, Bruno had never once done something without a reason. So Walter grabbed his lantern, pulled his old coat off the hook by the door, and went out into the rain after him. The ground was soft. The trees dripped. The lantern light made the mist glow orange a few feet in every direction and nothing beyond that. Walter found Bruno at the base of a fallen pine that had come down in last week's wind. The old dog was not sitting anymore. He was standing, low to the ground, and he was nuzzling something half buried beneath the broken trunk. Walter came closer and crouched down. The thing was small, roughly the size of a shoebox. It was covered in scales that caught the lantern light and threw it back in colors that had no business being there in the dark of a Pacific Northwest forest. Teal, mostly, but with gold threading through the spine and along the edges of what appeared to be folded wings pressed flat against its sides. It was breathing. Shallow, slow breaths that shook its whole small body. Walter had spent 22 years as a wildlife ranger. He had handled injured owls, orphaned fawns, a black bear cub, a rattlesnake with a broken jaw, and once, memorably, a mountain lion that had stumbled into a fence. He had never seen anything like this. He did not ask himself what it was. That question could come later. Right now it was cold and hurt and in the rain, and that was enough. He shrugged off his coat and worked it under the creature as gently as he could. It made a sound, not a cry exactly, more like a low vibration that he felt in his back teeth, and then went still. Bruno stepped back to let Walter work and then fell into step behind him as Walter carried it back toward the house. Inside, Walter laid the bundle near the wood stove where the heat would reach it. He pulled back one corner of the coat to check on it and found two eyes looking up at him. They were the color of pale amber, steady and aware despite everything. Not frightened, just watching. Bruno circled once, sniffed carefully at the edge of the coat, and then lay down beside it. He put his big gray chin on his paws and closed his eyes. That, apparently, was settled. Walter pulled his armchair close to the stove and sat down. He thought about the phone in his kitchen. He thought about the ranger station, the university down in the valley, the wildlife rehabilitation center an hour south. He thought about all the forms and all the questions and all the official eyes that would come with any of those calls. Then he looked at the thing by the stove, breathing a little steadier now, and he looked at Bruno sleeping next to it like it was the most natural arrangement in the world, and he decided that all those calls could wait until morning. Morning came without him having made any of them. He had fallen asleep in the chair. The fire had burned to coals. Outside the window the rain had stopped, and the first gray light was sitting on the mountain in that quiet way it did after a hard night. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. Bruno was still asleep. So was the creature, tucked against the old dog's side, its small-scaled body rising and falling in a slow and easy rhythm. The coat had slipped off sometime in the night, and the scales had caught the early light coming through the window. And for just a moment the whole corner of the room glowed gold and teal, and something Walter had no word for. He got up, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. He would figure out what it was. But not before coffee. She grew fast. That was the first real surprise, though by the third week Walter had stopped sorting his surprises into categories. The creature, he had started calling her Sora, a word he half remembered from somewhere meaning sky, and it had stuck, had arrived the size of a shoebox, and was now closer to the size of a border collie. If a border collie had wings and scales and eyes that tracked everything in the room with careful, unblinking interest. She ate well. Raw fish from the creek at the bottom of the property, venison scraps from the freezer, once an entire 2-pound trout that she swallowed in 4 enthusiastic bites, while Bruno watched with what Walter could only describe as polite concern. She slept mostly at night, explored mostly in the day, and had claimed the south end of the porch as her territory by the end of the first week in a way that was perfectly clear without requiring any announcement. Bruno had not left her side in 22 days. This was the part that moved Walter most, though he did not talk about it, even to himself. Bruno was old. His back hips had been bad since the previous winter. Some mornings it took him a full minute to get up from his bed, and Walter had begun keeping the heat on low overnight just to take the stiffness out of the joints. Bruno was the kind of tired that lived deep in the bones. He had earned it. And yet every morning Bruno rose and followed Sora around the property. He herded her away from the steep drop at the property's north edge. He positioned himself between her and every strange sound from the tree line. When she tested her wings by gliding off the porch railing and landing badly in the dirt below, Bruno was beside her before she had shaken the dust off, sniffing her over carefully before allowing her to try again. The thing Walter noticed at the end of the second week was this. Bruno's walk had changed. Not dramatically, but the hitch in his left hip was less pronounced. He was getting up faster in the mornings. He was not wincing on the porch stairs. Walter watched Sora press herself against Bruno's side each evening. Her warm body fitted along the length of his ribs, and he thought about heat and about what warmth could do for old joints and old bones, and he chose not to examine it too closely. Some things deserved to be let alone. He did try to research her. He spread his search across 3 evenings. Wildlife databases, university archives, cryptozoology sites he felt faintly embarrassed visiting, 2 emails to former colleagues who knew their animals. Nothing matched. Not the scale pattern, not the wingspan to body ratio, not the jaw structure, not the amber eyes. She was not in any record he could find. He considered calling the ranger station. He considered it seriously, sitting at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand and the light on and Sora asleep on the porch outside the window. Then he thought about what happened to things that could not be classified. He thought about the paperwork and the vans and the people with clipboards who used words like specimen and sample. He put the phone down. She had a name. She had a dog who loved her and a porch she had claimed and a creek she visited every morning at dawn. That was enough of a life to protect. Far above the mountain, in a place Walter did not know existed, a ship moved through the outer edge of Earth's atmosphere on a course so precise it left no thermal trace, no radar echo, nothing. The Variety Survey fleet had been mapping this planet at a distance for 30 years. It was a standard Class F cataloging, primitive dominant species, pre-contact, low atmospheric tech, no significant risk. The work was mostly automated, until a junior biological scanner flagged an anomaly in the scan data from the Pacific Northwest sector, a heat signature that did not match any known Earth species, a cellular pattern that did not match any known Earth biology at all. Admiral Dreen reviewed the flag with the mild irritation of someone who had been promised a routine assignment. He pulled up the raw data, ran it through 2 filters, and went still. He ran it through a 3rd filter. Then he sat back and looked at the readout for a long time. He called for Scout Galt. The instructions were short. Go down. Confirm the signature. Do not interact with native species. Return with a tissue sample if possible and a visual confirmation either way. Clean, quiet, fast. Galt's shuttle detached from the lower hull of the fleet ship and angled toward the dark surface of the mountain below. From the inside, Galt watched the altitude reading drop. His orders were simple, and he was good at simple orders. He did not know yet what was waiting at the bottom of that mountain. Neither did Walter. Neither did Bruno. But Sora, sleeping on the porch in the mountain dark, opened one amber eye and held it open for a long moment before closing it again. Galt sat down in a ravine 2 ridges east of the target coordinates. He had landed on 14 worlds, and this one was unremarkable by every measure. Wet, dark, heavy with the smell of things growing and rotting and growing again. He sealed his suit against the air, checked his scanner, and moved west through the trees on foot, the way protocol required on Class F worlds where any sign of a craft could contaminate a native population's development. The scanner led him through an hour of forest before the tree line thinned, and a clearing opened ahead with a small wooden structure at its center. A homestead, single building, outbuildings, split rail fence along the south side. Firelight in the windows. An old vehicle parked near the barn, a model Galt recognized from the fleet's Earth culture archive as several decades obsolete. He crouched at the tree line and raised his optical scope. The elderly native was inside, visible through the window, moving slowly between a counter and a table. A large canine, old, gray-muzzled, was asleep on the porch. Standard Earth domestic animal. Galt noted it and moved his scope left. He stopped. On the porch, in the spill of light from the window, curled near the sleeping canine, was the source of the biological signature. It was larger than the preliminary scan had suggested, closer to a meter from snout to tail now, with its wings folded tight. The scales caught the light and split it into colors that had no business coming off a biological surface. Galt's skin data was already running. The readout populated fast. He read it twice. He read it a third time because the first two felt like a malfunction. Caliph. The identifier was clear and confirmed across 4 separate scan parameters. He had studied them in the Fleet Academy the way one studied myths, as things that had once existed and did not anymore. The last confirmed sighting had been 40 years ago near a dying star cluster at the edge of Varadi Survey Range. The species had been declared effectively extinct by the Biological Council 9 years after that. Galt lowered the scope. He understood, immediately and completely, what this meant. A living caliph on a Class F world. On Earth. On a farmer's porch, asleep next to a dog. He reported back to Admiral Dreen in a flat, careful voice. Dreen's response came back fast. Retrieve it. The native species are incidental. Use minimal disruption. Resolve within 1 rotation. Galt pocketed the communicator and looked back at the porch. He moved in at dusk, an hour later. He came in from the northeast, staying low, using the shadow of the barn to cover his approach. His containment kit was ready. He had done this kind of work before: sample collection, passive retrieval, observation up close. It was not complicated work. He reached the fence, 20 meters from the porch. He could see the canine clearly now, the rise and fall of its breathing, the gray in its fur, the way its big front paws were crossed beneath its chin. Then the paws uncrossed. Bruno's head came up. Not fast, not sudden. The slow, deliberate raise of an animal that has been awake for some time and has simply decided to stop pretending otherwise. The cloudy eyes found Galt in the shadow of the barn with an accuracy that should not have been possible in that dark. Bruno stood up. Each movement was careful and stiff. Galt could see the age in the joints, the way the hips engaged slowly. But he stood, and once he was standing, he walked to the edge of the porch, descended the 2 steps to the yard, and placed himself between Galt's position and the barn wall where Sora slept. He did not bark. He sat down. He looked at Galt. That was all. That was the whole thing. An old dog, in a dark yard, sitting down between a stranger and the thing he was protecting. Sora woke. Galt saw the amber eyes open, saw them find Bruno first, and then follow Bruno's gaze to where Galt stood in the shadow. She rose to her feet, her wings half spread, not attacking, not fleeing, holding. The sound that came from her throat was low and layered in a way no instrument Galt carried could cleanly separate into a frequency range. The porch light switched on. The door opened. Walter Briggs stepped out in worn boots and a flannel shirt with a flashlight in one hand, and the unconcerned expression of a man who has stepped out to check on a noise before and knows how these things go. He shone the flashlight toward the yard, caught nothing because Galt was still in shadow, and looked at Bruno instead. Whatever he read in Bruno's posture made him step down into the yard himself, unhurried, and stand beside the old dog. 3 of them in the yard now. One of them a man with a flashlight. One of them an old dog sitting in the dark. One of them a creature that 3 generations of Varadi biologists had cataloged as extinct. And across the fence, Galt stood in the shadow of the barn and understood, with the quiet certainty of a professional who has been in the field long enough to read a situation, that this particular retrieval had just become something else entirely. He stepped back into the trees. He told Dreen the situation required reassessment. Dreen said he would come down himself. Walter did not sleep. Not properly. He sat in the armchair near the window with the flashlight on the side table and the wood stove burning and a blanket across his knees, and he dozed in short stretches and woke each time the wind shifted or a branch moved outside. Something had been in the yard. He was sure of it. Not an animal, Bruno's reaction had been wrong for an animal. Bruno would have barked at a bear. Bruno would have chased a deer. Bruno had sat down and looked, which meant Bruno had made a judgment call, which meant whatever had been out there had been something worth judging. Walter was not a man who frightened easily, but he was a man who paid attention to his dog. Sora did not sleep at all. He watched her through the window. She moved around the edges of the property in slow circuits, her teal wings half open for balance, her head low. She moved the way Walter had once seen a mother elk move when she had caught a predator's scent, not running, not hiding, mapping, learning where every sound came from and where it went. Bruno walked beside her each circuit, step for step, and Walter noticed again that the old dog's limp was almost entirely gone. At 2 in the morning, Sora stopped her circuit and stood at the north fence for a long time, looking at the tree line. Her scales had started doing something new, a faint gold light, barely a glow, moving slowly up her spine the way a wave moves. Walter had never seen it before. He watched it and felt a peculiar calm, the way you felt in the presence of something very old that knew what it was doing. He got up, went to the back room, and pulled out his old Ranger pack from the shelf above the closet. He had not used it in 4 years. He checked the contents by habit: first aid kit, emergency radio, rope, fire striker, a folding knife in a worn leather sheath, 2 energy bars that were probably stale. He set them all out on the kitchen table and repacked slowly and carefully. He did not know what he was preparing for. He prepared anyway. That had always been his way. He made a thermos of coffee. He put on a second pair of socks. He went back to the window. Above the mountain, the Verati command vessel adjusted its positioning. Admiral Dreen had authorized a surface operation and coordinator when the fleet's senior charter observer, present on board to ensure protocol was followed, had immediately filed a formal objection notice. Wynn did this quietly, through the proper channels, with the measured tone of someone who knew their objection would be noted and ignored, but intended to be on record regardless. Caliph classification under Verati Charter was unambiguous. They were protected biological entities. Any retrieval operation required council authorization, biological handlers with species-specific credentials, and the explicit consent of any bonded parties if bonding had occurred. Dreen had read the charter. He had also read 30 years of survey reports on Earth and had come to believe, as many in the fleet privately believed, that Class F protocol was a bureaucratic inconvenience applied to planets that would never know the difference. He authorized the full retrieval team. 6 units. Ground entry at 0300 local time. He would command from a forward position himself, which was unusual, and told Galt, who noticed these things, that the Admiral wanted the Caliph very badly. Galt said nothing and prepared his kit. Deputy Rail, the youngest officer in the forward unit, reviewed the Caliph file during the descent and then sat quietly for a long time looking at the photographs from Galt's optical scope. The old man with the flashlight. The gray-muzzled dog sitting in the yard. The creature with its wings spread, not attacking, standing beside the dog. Rail thought about the word bonded in the charter language. The charter used it in a specific biological sense. A caliph that had chosen a companion species formed a connection that, under Verati understanding, fundamentally altered the creature's biological state. A bonded caliph was not a specimen. It was a partner. Rail looked at the photograph again. The dog sitting between the alien scout and the creature. The creature standing behind the dog and not leaving. He closed the file and said nothing. He was 23 standard years old and very junior, and this was not the moment to say anything. He stored the thought carefully, the way you stored something you knew you would need later. On the ground, Sora stopped her circuit and stood in the center of the yard. She folded her wings flat. She faced north toward the trees. The gold light along her spine was steady now. Bruno walked to her side and sat. Walter came out onto the porch with his thermos and his pack, looked at the two of them, and understood that whatever was coming now. He stood up straight. He put the thermos down on the porch railing. He crossed his arms, and he waited. The same way he had waited out storms and floods and long, hard winters in these mountains for 30 years, with the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with having decided. They came out of the trees in a line. 6 figures in gray suits that caught no light and gave none back, moving through the yard in the kind of practiced silence that spoke of long training. At the front of them, taller than the others, with a wider build and something on his suit's shoulder that Walter's eye read as a rank marker even without knowing what it meant, was Dreen. They stopped at the fence. Dreen looked at the yard. He looked at the old man on the porch, the old dog in the yard, and Sora standing at the center of the property with her wings half spread and the gold light running slow and steady up her spine. He looked for a long moment. Then he put one hand on the fence post and stepped over it and walked into the yard and stopped 10 meters from Sora. He spoke. The sound that came out was not English, and then, a half-second later, it was a small device at his collar processing and projecting the translation with a faint mechanical edge. This is a variety survey operation. The biological entity on your property has been identified as a caliph, a species of significant scientific and cultural importance under Variety Charter. We are authorized to retrieve it for study and preservation. You and your animal will not be harmed. You have our word on this. The speech was practiced. It was probably not the first time Dreen had given a version of it. Walter listened to all of it without moving. He listened the way he listened to things that needed full attention, completely, with no part of him rushing ahead to his answer. When it was done, he uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his coat pockets. She's not in it, Walter said. She's got a name. Dreen paused. It was a short pause, the kind a man allowed himself when he was recalibrating without wanting to show it. The retrieval will take place regardless. I would prefer it to be simple. I imagine you would, Walter said. Dreen raised one hand to signal the flanking units. Bruno stood up. He had been sitting in the yard between Dreen and Sora, and no one had paid him particular attention. He was an old dog in a dark yard, which was easy to overlook. But now he stood, slow and deliberate as always, and he walked forward. Not toward Dreen's sides, not circling, directly toward Dreen, step by careful step, until he was standing 4 meters away with nothing between them. Then he sat down again. He looked up at Dreen with old, cloudy eyes that held nothing resembling fear. No growl, no display, just a very old animal that had placed itself in a specific spot and intended to stay there. Behind Bruno, Sora stepped forward and pressed the side of her head against Bruno's shoulder. The gold light along her spine intensified, not dramatically, not as a threat, but like a lamp being turned up slowly. It lit the yard in a color that had no name in any variety reference catalog and did not need one. Every scanner on every unit in the field went quiet. Not jammed. Galt checked his instruments twice and understood the difference. Jammed equipment threw error codes and static. These simply stopped reporting, the way a person stops talking when they suddenly understand they are in the presence of something that does not need to be scanned. From the ship, Coordinator Wynn's voice came through on the command channel, clear and sharp. Admiral Dreen, I am invoking Charter Section 9, Subsection 4. Caliph Bonding Protocol. The subject has demonstrably bonded with native species on this world. Retrieval without council authorization is a charter violation. I am ordering a stand down. Dreen's jaw tightened. You do not have command authority over a surface operation, Coordinator. I have charter authority, which supersedes surface command in bonding cases. I have logged this action. The council will review within one standard cycle. You may proceed if you wish to do so under a formal violation flag. The channel was quiet for 4 seconds. Galt took one step backward. It was not an order. It was a choice, made alone, in the way that small moral choices are always made, quietly, quickly, with no fanfare. The two flanking units looked at each other, and then, following Galt's lead with the instinct of people who trusted him, stepped back as well. Dreen stood alone in the center of the yard. He looked at the old man on the porch. The old man looked back without hostility and without satisfaction and without any of the things Dreen might have known how to answer. Just a person, standing on their porch, in their coat, on their land, having said 2 simple sentences and done nothing else at all. He looked at the dog sitting in front of him. The dog did not look away. He looked at the creature beside the dog, lit in that quiet gold, watching him with amber eyes that were older than anything that Small had any right to be. Dreen lowered his hand. Stand down, he said. His voice was even. We are withdrawing. No one said anything. The 6 units turned and moved back toward the tree line, and the dark took them one by one until only the trees were left and the sound of the mountain and the faint drip of water from the porch eave. Sora folded her wings. The gold light softened and settled. Bruno walked back to the porch steps and laid down at the bottom of them. Walter picked up his thermos. He poured himself a cup of coffee in the dark yard, standing alone, and drank it slowly while the forest went quiet around him. 3 days passed. Walter did not mark them as significant days. He split wood. He repaired a section of fence on the south side of the property that had been leaning since August. He went down to the creek with Sora, who was learning that salmon did not stay still for very long and had begun to develop a personal policy about this, involving a fast vertical dive from a low branch that worked about 1 time in 4. Bruno watched from the bank with the patient expression of someone who had seen enthusiasm fail before and believed in it anyway. On the morning of the 4th day, Walter found a small object on the porch railing. It was the size of a flattened stone, smooth, made of something that was not metal and not glass, but had qualities of both. It sat there in the early light without doing anything, except that when he picked it up, it was faintly warm in a way that was not the sun's doing, and the surface had a slight texture under his thumb that felt intentional. He turned it over several times. On the underside was a single line of markings that he could not read, but that had the shape of a message, something someone had wanted to say in a compact and permanent way. He set it back on the railing. He had a rough idea of what it was. A way to reach them, if he chose. A door left open by someone who was, perhaps, not entirely like the one who had stood in his yard and given a speech. He thought about the person on the other side of that action, someone who had slipped back down from orbit in the dark to leave a stone on a stranger's porch railing in the mountains. He thought about what it took to do a thing like that quietly and leave nothing else. He left the object on the railing and went inside to make breakfast. Far above the mountain, the Varadi fleet had shifted course. Aboard the command vessel, Coordinator Wynne had completed her formal report and submitted it to the Charter Council. The language was precise and without drama. One Caliph located, living and healthy, on a Class F world, in apparent voluntary habitation with native Earth species, status confirmed as bonded under Chapter 9 parameters. Retrieval attempt made, subsequently stood down on charter grounds. Recommendation: Earth classification revised upward to Class B, passive observation only. No further contact operations authorized without Council review. The Council received the report and quietly revised the classification within 2 standard cycles, as Wynne had recommended. They did not announce it. In the administrative language of the Varadi Survey Division, it was a routine update. No one sent a message to Earth about it. No one held a meeting. The K9 did not retreat. The human did not escalate. The Caliph chose them both, and in choosing them placed herself between an admiral with a retrieval order and whatever harm might follow. The question I would put to anyone who reads this file is a simple one. We came to this planet with a classification system that placed its inhabitants near the bottom of our scale of significance. We left having been stopped, not by any weapon or technology, but by an old dog sitting down in a dark yard and a man who said that names matter. I think we should reconsider what significance means and who gets to assign it. The annotation circulated. Not widely, not officially, but it went where things go when they find the right readers. On the mountain, autumn had settled in fully. The aspens along the ridge had gone gold, and the mornings were cold enough now that frost sat on the fence rails until noon. Sora had grown again in the way she grew, suddenly, in a burst, so that Walter went to bed one night and woke the next morning to find her a hand's width longer and her wingspan broader by the same. She filled the porch now when she stretched. She glided the full length of the property without trouble and had begun going higher, into the treetops and then above them. Though she always came back and always found Bruno first when she landed. Bruno, Walter had stopped pretending not to notice, moved like a dog of 6. His hips were easy. His eyes were clearer. He slept well and woke fast, and spent his mornings trotting the fence line with Sora overhead, and his evenings pressed against her side by the stove, both of them breathing in the slow and easy rhythm of animals that have no worries about tomorrow. Walter sat on the porch in the last of the afternoon light, the communication token from the railing now resting on the table beside him, his coffee going cold. He looked at the token for a while. He thought about open doors and what you did with them when you were not sure what was on the other side. He left it on the table. Sora landed on the barn roof above him with a sound like a flag catching wind, folded her wings, and looked out over the valley the way she liked to do in the late afternoon, scanning the distance for whatever dragons scan for when the world goes gold and quiet. Bruno came up the porch steps and lay down across Walter's boots. The mountain held its breath in the way it always did before dark, that long pause between the last light and the first stars when everything settles and everything is still and the world, for a moment, seems to know exactly what it is. Walter picked up his coffee. He drank it cold. He watched the tree line the way he always had. And the evening came in, slow and familiar, over the mountain.